Welcome to Storymakers, the Storymakers podcast, a place where curiosity and play meet to spark faith through the imagination. I'm your host, Mel, and I will introduce you to new friends who will share hope for the kids and teens in your life, with a dose of encouragement for us grown-ups too. Let's get the party started. Hey, Storymakers. Welcome to the podcast. Super pumped up. We have Kathleen from the Pour Over today. Hey, Kathleen. Thank you so much for joining. I'm so excited. Over here in Storymaker Land, we are super fans of the Pour Over. We've loved you from afar for a long time. And this last year, I met Kathleen in person at the TGC conference, which was so exciting. We were super fans, and she's agreed to come and meet you all too here in our pod. So, hey, Kathleen, welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, it was fun to meet you in person.
Yeah, it was so great to meet you guys, and we just love what you guys do. So if you don't know what the Pour Over is, Storymakers, Mockingbird fans, everyone out there, you want to get in touch, you want to get involved, and you want to know about it. So Kathleen, give us the 411. What are the highs around the Pour Over?
Okay. So my elevator spiel, the Pour Over is a trustworthy news resource guiding people towards eternal hope. That's what we tell people. But what that actually means is we are a news summary that wants to inform Christians on what's going on in the world and keep them focused on Christ. We want our audience to be able to get our summary 3 times a week and be able to walk into a workplace or any sort of situation where people might say, did you hear about XYZ news story? And they're able to say, I heard about it. I'm not stressed about it. I know the story and I'm good to go. So our the big pieces of what we do are we're politically neutral. We're always going to point people back to Christ, and we're going to be quick about it. We're not going to dwell on any news story. We want it to just be a really brief summary of what's going on. So that's us.
Yeah, Kathleen, I mean, you all are so brave to be out in the news world. As sensational and wild. It just seems like such wild territory. And what you guys have done is such an incredible job of hitting your mission. I mean, honestly, like I run across it on IG and I think, oh my gosh, that's so stressful. And then you see the news and then you're like, wait, just take a beat, take a breath, pray. And like, God's got everything in control, just like he always has. And so I love that aspect of the Pour Over. So Kathleen, tell us, here in Storymaker Land, we're super curious. We love imagination and we love faith. And we would love to know more about you and your story and how your faith has been sparked by maybe imagination or maybe not, maybe the news.
Yeah. Well, let's see. When you ask me what my story is, my first reaction is like, I don't really have one, but I'll use my imagination and there's something there. So I think the biggest thing for me is when I look back on my life to this point, I can see the way God has always been there, weaving his story. My favorite like image that I have is an image of like a tapestry, you know, like you see the threads on the backside of it and you're like, I don't know what this is supposed to be. There's a lot of knots there. It's pretty messy. This is, I don't know what, and then you turn it around. It's a really pretty picture. So I feel like that's a good way of describing my life. I mean, I had a great childhood. I've had a great life thus far, but I never really I don't know. I just thought I knew where I was going. And I, went to school for human environmental sciences, which was like my 5th major, maybe. I lost count. I didn't know what I wanted to do. And I always kind of envisioned, I don't know, some sort of at first I wanted to do nutrition and personal training. Like it was always this why should I fit into a box of one thing? I think I want to create this own mold for myself. I want to do this and this. And even whenever I did land on a major, I just did a broad major because I couldn't figure out what one thing I wanted to focus on. I ended up working in an office job that had nothing to do with any of that I just said, but it led me to meeting my husband and moving to Chicago from Alabama, which was totally not what I thought I was going to be doing. And then I found the Pour Over, and that was just a total God thing. Somebody in my small group introduced it to me, and I got subscribed and volunteered basically. My husband had just been deployed and I was like, I have some extra time on my hands. I'm here in Chicago. Anyway, and so even with that, figuring out how I could fit that into an office job and kind of thinking outside of the box about how can I have two jobs? How can I do two things? And then we ended up having to move for his job. And so I went to my office job and said, okay, there's not a remote position for me, but what can I do? And I had this I basically schemed up this idea of a position that maybe they could give me if they wanted to. And I totally think it's all through God's provision that people accepted my crazy ideas, but it gave me that job. And then of course, 2020 happened and everybody went remote anyway. So I probably didn't have to try that hard, but so then I had, the two jobs with that and the pour over, and then ended up, just dropping down to the pour over. So I think the coolest part about looking back on what I've done, and I haven't done anything outside of, my relationship with God, but what I've been able to, the pattern I've been able to see is that God's always weaving some kind of story in there for me. And I don't really know what it is, but as long as I don't, stay inside the box, I think outside of the box a little bit, I can take a couple steps and figure out where he wants me to go. And so I don't know if that answers your question, but
no, I think that's so great. Well, I mean, that's such a story maker, it's having the sort of that imagination and framework towards looking backwards and seeing how God has been shaping and moving in our lives. And I think for so many of us, there's not a really linear delineation of where we land all the time. And so I think it's such a faithful answer to be able to look back and say oh, well, he was carrying me through all of those moments into all of these curious spaces. And here I am. And you guys are, hosting such a beautiful ministry because, I think you'd have to be living under a rock not to be anxious about the news. It's just everywhere. You can't go to the airport without seeing it. It's in our cabs, it's everywhere. You cannot escape what the world is saying is most important at all times. And we're so saturated with information coming at us all the time. And so, Catherine, so what has been really exciting at the pour over for you, in the ministry, especially as we, tomorrow's the big election day, and I'm sure there are a lot of anxious hearts out there. What would you say to folks as they, are sort of navigating, riding the waves of emotion in this moment?
Yeah. We have our Christian perspectives we pair with our news stories. Our news stories are very concise, like I mentioned, 135 words, and I'm the one who makes sure that it's 135 words. I try and stick to that because one of the other things that's important to us is a healthy relationship with the news. It's like you said, that we're just inundated with information. And I can remember feeling overwhelmed by the news, from a young age. I remember the moment when I first was it was after Hurricane Katrina down south, and it was just a 24-hour cycle of sadness. And so being young and realizing that, and now thinking about kids growing up and having even more access to media, all ages, all facets of, of society are just inundated with information. So we feel very strongly that you can be informed with short stories, basically. You can spend a minimal amount of time in the news and still be informed. And then, like I said, we pair them with Christian perspectives, and our Christian perspectives fall into the same categories. Any Christian perspective we pair with a story. It's going to be an eternal perspective, above all love, choose humility, or be doers. Those are our pillars.
That's amazing.
And we do get pushback that we repeat the same Christian perspectives, but that's actually the trick. We want people to get into the habit of, no matter what information you're seeing, having it's muscle memory, having your first reaction be, okay, this might be a big story today, but okay, as hard as it is to fathom, in 1,000 years, this story might not matter, And that's one of our biggest reminders. And then also how to interact with other people in light of a story. I think that's a huge part of everybody's feeling anxious personally. And it's hard to bottle that up. It spills over. And how does it spill over? Not very
Well,
not very
not
well.
always the most gracious,
Right.
It's like Facebook has brought out the worst in like,
Yeah.
I don't know, social activity. So
Yeah, we could have a whole conversation on that. But reminding people that at at the end of the day, Christians can both love two Christians can both love Jesus, be saved, be very secure in their salvation, and have different political ideas, which is a radical statement. But if we can continually remind people of that, keep your eyes on eternity, love everybody, hopefully with repetition and reminding, we'll have some better reactions to news and to the information that people are inundated with.
Yeah, so I think that's what's so cool about pour over, because you're helping grown-ups reorient their imaginations. We talk about that all the time in Storymaker Land. And, back in we used to say like, oh, your imagination grows flabby over time as you become an adult. But actually, I think it becomes more activated towards negative and more extremes. And so the news just feeds into that part of who we are. I'm naturally assuming the worst case scenario, the worst of others. And so it's just, we need these other kinds of ministries like the pour over to help reorient our imaginations. And especially, we're talking a lot to parents and to people in youth and family, and Gen Z is hyper aware of what's happening in the world, and alpha, and they are activators, and they are people that are showing up to protests, and they're asking why. And so I think as Christian parents, it's really important for us to have the information so that they can have a conversation. And I think what you guys are doing too is orienting parents and helping them have healthy conversations with their kids, because they may disagree with their neighbor, their aunts or uncles, but how they engage with their kids in their home is going to be really impactful for how they view God and their relationship.
Yeah, that's interesting that you talk about the imagination, because I think something we talk about a lot is that people choose the path of least resistance. And so maybe if you hear a news story or you hear somebody's perspective on a news story, your first instinct, probably without having to use your imagination too much, is to assume you guys are on opposite sides. It's very easy to just fill in the blank with like, you are voting for this person, so you must believe XYZ, you must be this type of person. Super easy to get to that conclusion. The imagination comes in when you put yourself in their shoes, or when you try and say first, what might I have in common with this person? That's a really big mental exercise that, I feel like I am still having that area of my, imagination refined as my, in my job at the pour over, because we often have to write a story and put ourselves in different people's shoes. How might this group of, of readers read this sentence? How might this group of readers, take on our intent, whether we, actually meant that or not? Like, it's so easy to just jump to conclusions. So using our imagination to actually reel that back is important.
Yeah, no, I mean, it is easy to demonize and to subject people to our assumptions. And I think especially the world is facilitating those assumptions and making really easy for that to happen and divide us. And the wild thing about God is, and our Christian outlook and the whole thing, is that we were never meant to be divided against one another, but to be bound together, and even in our differences too, to find our humanity. And I think that that's so important. Kathleen, I know you offer the pour over on social media, and then aren't there other resources that you guys offer, like blog posts or other ways for folks to dig in?
Yeah. So our main product is a newsletter, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. We summarize 8 stories, more or less, every newsletter. So 3 main stories that are paired with those Christian perspectives and 5 quicker stories. That's our biggest thing. And then that content is turned into a podcast. Anywhere podcasts can be found, you can listen to somebody basically read you the newsletter. The stories are then turned into social media posts. And we also have decaf, which goes really well with what you were just talking about with parents. We take one story each week and rewrite it at a 7th grade reading level. Then we pair the story with reflection questions and some ideas for how to respond to the story. So that could look like, here's what's going on with the latest presidential candidates. Here's some reflection questions. How can I, and the questions always come back to some sort of question around how can I reflect the gospel to my kids in light of this story, or what might my kids misunderstand about this story, or what is a gospel lesson I can teach to my kids, in light of this story. So expanding on that, and a principle we always come back to, it seems like, is your reaction to this story will be seen by your kids. And you have an opportunity to model for them the gospel through your reaction to this story. So kind of putting that onus on the parents, and then some options for response. Because like you said, this is a generation of kids who, like, you read a story and it's like, that's great, but what can I do about it? And finding that balance between, like, you don't have to do something about everything, but if you feel prompted, here are some ideas.
I love that. Yeah. I mean, and it also feeds into like the fruits of the spirit. And for us grownups, it's so tough to have self-control and not to overly exert our opinions, especially when it comes to our kids. You're like, that's crazy,
Or even just seeing somebody on TV. What's the first thing that comes out of your mouth? Because your kids will hear that.
Yeah. They're right there. I mean, so I'm so grateful that you have some resources for us.
Well, it helps us too as parents. We're writing it and we're like, this is a reminder for me too.
Yeah, it's just such an impossible task. And I love the humility piece too that comes across every week, because I think in so many ways too, we can also apologize to our kids. It's like, whoa, I overreacted. I don't know the full scope, so sorry. Maybe we could revisit that or think about that in a different way. But I think that's so wonderful. And Kathleen, what have been I just was curious, because you're in the news cycle, what have been some exciting, maybe not so exciting, but grace forward stories that kind of just knocked you guys off your feet?
Stories we've covered, or that's a good question. I feel like being in the news cycle, there's just a pattern that I've noticed of, like, it's like maybe a 6-month cycle of we're going to cover the same things. And of course, right now and for the past few months, it's been the election. When the Ukraine war first started, it was that in every newsletter, obviously Israel in every newsletter. And so there are times when we feel like we're covering the same things over and over again. And there are times when we do a good job at just presenting the information. And then there are times when we may inadvertently not get the story right. But we're just trying to repeatedly present the information and point people back to God, right? I don't know if there's one like story that stands out in mind, but I will say that we've heard, of course, a lot of negative feedback maybe on how we've covered stuff, but it never fails that we've heard really encouraging stories about people responding to how we're presenting the same news that they have been seeing in this, cycle in a fresh way. They're able to actually just get the information that they need and take away whatever they need to take away from the story by way of how we cover it. So I don't know if there's one story that stands out. It's more people's reactions to a new way of getting the news. That's been really encouraging.
Yeah. I mean, I can only imagine that we're better off receiving information in a way that's not so aggressive or emotionally high emotion inducing. I mean, because then we're just better neighbors, and we can pray for these situations in a way that's, I think, less, bent in a specific way, and so I think that's so wonderful and freeing. And you guys are offering a moment of peace, and for us all to sort of move through the world and remember that God is still God, and that God is making all things good. So and he'll make everything right.
Covering it in less words is a big part of that. if people want more information on a topic, we link to all of our sources. We encourage people to go look into that, but we like to stay very true to our format of covering things very concisely. There have been times when we've stepped out from that. With like Israel and Hamas, we did do an explainer where I actually stayed up really late one night and I was just like, if we're going to cover this, which it seems like we're going to cover it a lot moving forward, we need to do our due diligence, look into the history of this region and give that information to our readers. And so we tried to put, like I said, that's one of the few times we've stepped out and kind of done an explainer post versus just summarizing the news, just to give people more context to what they were going to be reading for the next year now.
Yeah.
So that was received very well. I think that was one that we were not surprised by the response, but pleased by the desire our readers had to understand the context around this story. So that was one that we were pleased by the response.
That's awesome. Well, Kathleen, as we kind of peel off, I would love for you to leave our listeners with those 3 notes that you had mentioned at the beginning of our conversation as we find out whoever wins tomorrow. What would you say to our listeners as they go through their day?
Yeah, I would say whatever happens tomorrow, God is still God and Jesus is still Jesus, and your salvation, if you've accepted Jesus, is safe no matter what happens. So keep your eyes on eternity, knowing that chaos or disappointment, whatever emotion you feel around you tomorrow, that emotion is going to be temporary. I would also encourage everyone to remember that people you interact with are also people that Jesus died for. So your interactions with people, every little touch can be an opportunity for you to reflect the love of God to other people. And choosing humility often can be the greatest exercise of our imagination that we might come across at any given point of the day. So those are the top 3 things that I would say from our pillars.
Kathleen, that's just so amazing. Thank you for the encouragement, because I know that we've all had anxious hearts and we're always looking for the wrong leaders and the wrong kings. It's been the way the human race has gone since the beginning, since the garden.
Right.
We're always sort of looking to the left and the right and kind of wondering and reaching up and trying to see if we can do it better. And the reality is, and what you all continue to remind us of, is that there is one who came and there is one who loves us best and cares for us best, and he will carry us and see us through. And Absolutely. So Kathleen, thank you so much. And everyone go check out the Pour Over, especially if you have an anxious heart and you're news curious.
You're in good company.
That's a good, safe place to go. All right,
Thanks
friends.
So much,
We'll talk to you soon. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening. Today's episode of the Storymakers podcast was made possible by donors and produced by Mockingbird Ministries. Listen to more episodes and join the adventure at StorymakersNYC.com or follow us along on Instagram. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to podcasts. And don't forget, share the show with a friend or maybe 2 and use the code SMPodcast10 for 10% off your next order. Catch you next time.